What if your mother saw you not as a child, but as a political asset? Now, how would it feel to learn your entire childhood was a performance for the public? Could you survive a nursery run with military precision, where affection was scheduled and love was conditional? For most children, a mother's role is one of comfort and care. But for royal children, a mother is also a queen. Her duty is to the crown first, her bloodline second. The nursery becomes a training ground. The bedtime story is a history lesson. A hug might be a photo opportunity. These are the stories of queens who, by choice or by necessity, raised their children in ways that were anything but ordinary. They weren't always cruel, they weren't always cold, but they were always queens, and their methods, born from power, paranoia, and the crushing weight of a nation, shaped the futures of princes and princesses who would one day rule the world or be destroyed by it. Number 20. Why would a queen create a fake farm for her children? Marie Antoinette's children were woken up, not by palace servants, but by the smell of fresh bread. She baked herself in a special stone oven. Her daughter, Marie Therese, was made to personally deliver food and firewood to a designated poor family living on the Versailles grounds. The queen forbade her staff from clearing away toys her children left on the floor, insisting they learn to clean up after themselves. What do you do when you are the Queen of France and your world is the most opulent, artificial place on earth? You build another, even more artificial world. Marie Antoinette's Hameau de la Reine, or the Queen's Hamlet, was a fully functioning rustic farm built in the gardens of Versailles. It had a watermill, a dairy, a barn, and thatched roof cottages. It was a fantasy, and it was the central tool in her parenting philosophy. She was a follower of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a philosopher who argued that children should be raised naturally, away from the corrupting influence of society. For a queen, this was a radical idea. Royal children were typically raised by an army of governesses and tutors. They were miniature adults dressed in stiff clothes and taught court etiquette from the moment they could walk. Marie Antoinette rejected this. She wanted her children to experience a simple life. So at the Hameau, she and her children would dress in simple cotton dresses and straw hats. They would, milk cows, collect eggs from chickens, and tend to a garden. The cows were famously washed and perfumed daily. The milk pails were made of fine Sèvres porcelain. It wasn't a real farm. It was a stage set for a play about simplicity. This was a profound departure from royal tradition. French royal children were the enfants de France, the children of France. Their lives were public property. Their births were witnessed by crowds of courtiers to ensure no baby was swapped. Their daily routines were rituals. Marie Antoinette sought to give her children, Louis Joseph, Louis Charles, Marie Therese, and Sophie, a bubble of privacy and normalcy within the gilded cage of Versailles. Now, she breastfed her first child, Marie Therese, for a short while herself. This was unheard of. Royal babies were immediately handed over to a team of wet nurses. The court was scandalized. A queen's body was a state instrument meant for producing heirs, not for the common act of feeding. She also insisted on being the primary decision-maker in their upbringing, choosing their governesses and tutors herself, and overseeing their daily lessons. She focused on moral education over pure academics. She taught them about charity, not as an abstract concept, but by having them interact with poor children she brought to the estate. But there was a dark side to this idyllic experiment. While the queen and her children were playing shepherdess, France was starving. The image of the queen escaping her duties to live in a multi-million-livre fantasy farm fueled public anger. Her simple life was seen as a mockery of the real poverty faced by the French people. They saw it not as good parenting, but as another example of her detachment and extravagance. The lessons of the Hameau were meant to instill humility and empathy, and perhaps they did. When the revolution came, the royal family was imprisoned. The young Dauphin Louis Charles was separated from his family. His sister Marie Therese would be the only one to survive the ordeal. The simple life Marie Antoinette tried to simulate became a brutal reality. Her attempt to protect her children from the harshness of court life ultimately left them unprepared for the even harsher reality of a world that hated them. The farm was a beautiful idea, but it was a bubble, and bubbles always pop. Number 19. Could a prince raised in isolation ever truly rule? Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands was once asked why her daughter, Princess Juliana, had such a lonely childhood. The queen's response was blunt. She said it was better to be lonely than to be surrounded by people who would corrupt her. Juliana's only playmates were carefully selected and had to follow a strict protocol. They were not allowed to disagree with the princess or win any games against her. The isolation was so complete that when Juliana first attended a larger social event as a teenager, she was reportedly overwhelmed and did not know how to interact with her peers. Wilhelmina ruled the Netherlands for 50 years, one of the longest reigning monarchs in modern history. She was stern, disciplined, and deeply committed to her duty. She saw the monarchy as a sacred calling, and she intended to raise her only child, Juliana, to be her perfect successor. Her method was total control, enforced through extreme isolation. Juliana was born in 1909. For the first few years of her life, she lived in a small, enclosed world at Hetlu Palace. Her mother was a constant, powerful presence, but also a distant one. Wilhelmina's schedule was packed with state duties. And time with her daughter was structured and formal. Affection was not a priority. The priority was training. To educate her daughter, Wilhelmina created a special school class inside the palace. A handful of girls from aristocratic families were chosen to be Juliana's classmates. But this was not a normal school. The environment was sterile. The curriculum was designed by the queen. The teachers were under immense pressure. The goal was not for Juliana to learn social skills, but to receive an education without being exposed to any outside ideas that Wilhelmina deemed dangerous or frivolous. This environment had a profound effect on Juliana. She grew up shy and socially awkward. She longed for the normal life she could never have. People who knew her described her as warm and kind-hearted, but also deeply insecure. She was taught that she was special, but she was never allowed to feel normal. The queen's reasoning was rooted in her own experience and her perception of the world. Wilhelmina had ascended the throne as a young girl. She was raised to be tough and self-reliant. She saw the world outside the palace as a threat. The political turmoil of the early 20th century, with rising socialism and the fall of other monarchies, made her fearful. She believed that isolating Juliana was a way to protect her and the monarchy itself from contamination. But protection came at a cost. When Juliana finally came of age and began to take on public duties, her lack of experience with the real world was apparent. She was sometimes naive, and her judgment could be clouded by a desire to trust people, a reaction against her controlled upbringing. Her later life was marked by a series of personal crises, some involving questionable advisors who took advantage of her trusting nature. Wilhelmina's experiment in royal parenting was a paradox. She wanted to create a strong, capable ruler. But by shielding her daughter from every challenge and social complexity, she may have made her more vulnerable. The isolated princess became a beloved queen known for her down-to-earth style, which was a direct rejection of her mother's formality. She tried to give her own 4 daughters the freedom she never had. The story of Wilhelmina and Juliana is a stark illustration of a mother's attempt to forge a perfect heir. She built a fortress around her daughter to keep the world out, but she also locked her daughter in. Number 18 was a clockwork schedule, the only way to build an empire. At 6 a.m., a cannon blast would signal the start of the day for Queen Victoria's children. Every hour of their day was mapped out on a color-coded chart. Lessons in German started at age 3. By 7, they were studying French, Latin, history, and science for 7 hours a day. Their father, Prince Albert, designed a special moral book to log every transgression, every lie, and every tantrum. Small infractions were met with physical punishment or confinement to their rooms. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert did not leave the raising of their 9 children to chance. They saw it as a scientific project. Their goal was to produce a new kind of monarch, disciplined, educated, moral, and perfectly suited to lead a modern industrial empire. The nursery at Osborne House was less a playroom and more a laboratory. The architect of the system was Prince Albert. He was a man in the 19th century, a believer in progress, order, and systems. He had a difficult childhood himself and was determined to create a stable, structured environment for his own children. He designed the curriculum, hired the tutors, and oversaw every detail of their lives. Victoria, who had endured her own oppressive childhood under the Kensington system, fully supported his methods. Together, they believed they could engineer perfection. The focus of this intense experiment was their eldest son, Albert Edward, known as Bertie, the future King Edward VII. As Bertie was not the child his parents wanted. He was charming and sociable, but he was not an academic. He struggled with his lessons and rebelled against the rigid discipline. His parents saw this not as a difference in personality, but as a moral failing. They created a specific, grueling regime just for him. He was separated from his siblings to avoid their frivolous influence. He was surrounded by tutors who reported on his every move. His father would write him long, disappointed letters, criticizing his lack of progress. The pressure was immense. Albert wrote that Bertie's brain was empty and that he had a systematic idleness. This approach was not just about education, it was about character formation. The children were taught to be self-sufficient. At Osborne House, their seaside retreat, Albert had a Swiss-style cottage built for them. Here, they learned to cook, garden, and manage a household. The boys learned carpentry, the girls learned to make cheese and butter. It was a practical education meant to teach them the value of work and responsibility. But even this was highly structured, another part of the grand plan. The results of this parental experiment were mixed. The eldest daughter, Vicky, was brilliant and thrived in the academic environment. She was her father's favorite. But for Bertie, the system was a failure. It crushed his spirit and created a deep rift between him and his parents. When Prince Albert died suddenly in 1861, Victoria irrationally blamed Bertie. A few weeks before his death, Albert had traveled to Cambridge to confront Bertie about a romantic affair. Victoria believed the stress of the confrontation killed her husband. She never forgave her son. The clockwork upbringing did not produce the studious, serious king his parents had envisioned. Instead, Bertie became a famous playboy, known for his love of parties, food, and women. But when he finally became king, he was surprisingly successful. His social skills, so disdained by his parents, made him a popular and effective diplomat. He helped forge the alliances that would shape Europe. Victoria and Albert's method was born of good intentions. They wanted to raise children who were worthy of their immense power and responsibility. But their system was too rigid. It did not account for individual personalities. It valued intellect over emotion and conformity over creativity. They built a perfect system for a perfect child, but they forgot that children are not machines. Number 17, did forcing a prince to be a warrior make him a tyrant? Agrippina the Younger sent her son Nero to live with his aunt at the age of 2. She did this to save his life from the reigning emperor. When she was later exiled, he was raised by a dancer and a barber. Upon her return to power, she immediately took him back and hired the most famous philosopher in Rome, Seneca, to be his tutor, instructing Seneca to focus on rhetoric and history, not philosophy, which she considered a distraction from the pursuit of power. Agrippina the Younger was the great-granddaughter of the first Roman Emperor Augustus. Power was in her blood, and her entire life was a ruthless, single-minded campaign to place her son Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, later known as Nero, on the imperial throne. Her parenting was not about raising a good man, it was about forging a weapon. Her strategy was a masterclass in political manipulation. First, she needed to get close to power. She married her own uncle, the Emperor Claudius. This was a scandalous move, but it placed her at the very heart of the empire. She was now empress. Her next step was to secure the succession for Nero. Claudius already had a son, Britannicus, who was the rightful heir. Agrippina had to sideline him. She persuaded Claudius to adopt Nero. She then systematically removed anyone who supported Britannicus, using accusations of treason and black magic. She controlled the public image of the imperial family, commissioning statues and coins that showed Nero alongside Claudius, presenting him as the co-heir. She was building a narrative of power around her son. Her control over Nero's education was absolute. She chose his tutors carefully. Seneca was to teach him how to speak, persuade, and command. Burrus, the head of the Praetorian Guard, was to teach him military discipline and secure the loyalty of the army. She curated every piece of information he received. He was not taught to be empathetic or just. He was taught to be effective. Agrippina's relationship with her son was intensely close, but it was a closeness born of ambition, not affection. She was his chief political advisor, his strategist, and his protector. In the early years of his reign, after Claudius's convenient death, she was the true ruler of Rome. Her coins were issued with her image next to his, an unprecedented honor for a woman. She attended Senate meetings from behind a curtain, listening and directing. But the weapon she had forged eventually turned on her. As Nero grew older, he began to resent his mother's control. He wanted to pursue his own interests in music, art, and chariot racing, things Agrippina considered beneath the dignity of an emperor. He began to listen to other advisors, including Seneca and Burrus, who encouraged him to push his mother away. The power struggle between mother and son was brutal. Agrippina tried to use her influence to undermine him. She even threatened to support Britannicus, the rival heir she had worked so hard to displace. Nero's response was swift. Britannicus died under mysterious circumstances, likely poisoned at a dinner party. Nero's final act of liberation was to have his own mother assassinated. He tried to kill her by staging a boating accident, but she survived and swam to shore. He then sent soldiers to her villa to finish the job. According to the historian Tacitus, when the assassins came, she pointed to her womb and said, "Strike here," as if acknowledging that this was the source of the monster who was now killing her. Agrippina's unconventional parenting achieved its goal. She made her son emperor, but she had focused so intently on the mechanics of powerful alliances, the propaganda, the elimination of rivals, that she had neglected to instill any moral foundation. She taught him how to take power, but not how to wield it wisely. In raising a ruler, she created a tyrant, and his first act of tyranny was to destroy his creator. Number 16, what happens when a queen puts duty before her children? Prince Charles was 4 years old when his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, left for a 6-month tour of the Commonwealth. When she returned, the reunion was not a warm hug, but a formal handshake on a public platform. Charles and his sister Anne were raised primarily by nannies and governesses in Buckingham Palace. They had a nursery floor and would often have to make a formal appointment to see their mother, the Queen. For Queen Elizabeth II, the moment her father, King George VI, died, her life changed forever. She was no longer just a mother to her 2 young children, Charles and Anne. She was the sovereign of the United Kingdom and the head of the Commonwealth, and from that day forward, duty came first. This was not a choice born of coldness, but of a deep, ingrained sense of responsibility. Her entire life had been a preparation for this role. She was raised by a father who took his duty so seriously. It arguably shortened his life. She saw the crown not as a privilege, but as a lifelong sacred burden. Her children, by necessity, had to fit around this duty. The result was a childhood that was loving in its own way, but also distant and formal. The Queen and Prince Philip were often absent for long periods on official tours. In their absence, the nannies Mabel Anderson and Helen Lightbody were the primary caregivers. They were the ones who were there for scraped knees, bedtime stories, and daily routines. Prince Charles in particular was a sensitive and introspective child. He craved the affection and attention that his mother, burdened by affairs of state, could not always provide. His authorized biography by Jonathan Dimbleby describes a lonely boy who found solace in the company of his grandmother, the Queen Mother, and his great-uncle, Lord Mountbatten. These figures offered the warmth and emotional support that were often missing from his relationship with his parents. The Queen's parenting style was very much a product of her class and her time. It was common for aristocratic children to be raised by staff. The idea of a hands-on, emotionally expressive parent was not the norm. For the Queen, her model was her own upbringing, which was also structured and formal. The focus of the royal upbringing was on preparing the children for their future roles. It was about discipline, public service, and understanding the institution they were born into. Charles, as the heir, bore the brunt of this. His education was a matter of national importance. He was the first heir to the throne to go to school rather than be tutored exclusively at the palace, a decision spearheaded by Prince Philip. He was sent to Gordonstown, a tough boarding school in Scotland, an experience he famously described as Colditz in kilts. The school's focus on rugged self-reliance was Philip's idea, meant to toughen up his sensitive son. The Queen's relationship with her younger children, Andrew and Edward, born more than a decade after Charles and Anne, was reportedly warmer and more relaxed. By this point, she was more settled in her role as monarch. She had more time and was more confident as a mother. She was known to bathe them and read to them herself. The consequences of this duty-first approach have been debated for decades. It certainly shaped Prince Charles profoundly, contributing to his complex character and his own search for meaning and affection. It highlights the central conflict for any reigning monarch, who is also a parent, the clash between the public role and the private self, between the needs of the crown and the needs of a child. Queen Elizabeth II chose the crown. It was the only choice she felt she could make. Number 15, could speaking 9 languages save a prince's life? Cleopatra VII insisted her son Caesarion be educated not just in Greek and Egyptian, but in at least 7 other languages, including Hebrew, Arabic, and the language of the Parthians. She personally tutored him in politics and diplomacy, staging mock negotiations with court officials. Before he was a teenager, he was co-ruler of Egypt, his name and image appearing alongside his mother's on official decrees and temple walls. Since Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of Egypt, she was also a brilliant strategist in a world dominated by Roman men. She knew that her kingdom's survival depended not on military might, which she lacked, but on intellect, diplomacy, and alliances. Her parenting of her eldest son, Ptolemy XV Caesar, better known as Caesarion, was a direct extension of this strategy. She was not just raising a son, she was forging a king who could navigate the treacherous political landscape she inhabited. Caesarion's father was Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome. This lineage was both Caesarion's greatest asset and his greatest danger. It gave him a claim to Roman power, but it also made him a threat to Caesar's adopted son and heir, Octavian. Cleopatra knew her son's life would be a constant balancing act. His education was designed to prepare him for this. The focus on languages was a practical tool. A king who could speak directly to Parthian ambassadors or Jewish merchants without a translator held a significant advantage. It was a sign of respect and a tool for gaining intelligence. Cleopatra herself was famous for being the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian language. She understood the power of communication, but his education went far beyond languages. From a very young age, Cleopatra involved Caesarion in the duties of state. She named him her co-ruler when he was just 3 years old. This was a political statement. It solidified his position as her heir and linked the future of Egypt directly to the legacy of Julius Caesar. He would appear with her in public ceremonies, often dressed as the god Horus, son of the goddess Isis, a role his mother frequently adopted. This was religious and political propaganda rolled into one. It presented their rule as divinely ordained. She trained him in the art of kingship. This was not a theoretical education. He watched her manage the economy, negotiate with foreign envoys, and command the loyalty of her people. He learned that power was a performance. It was about how you presented yourself, the symbols you used, and the stories you told. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra formed a new alliance with another powerful Roman, Mark Antony. She had 3 more children with him. This further complicated Caesarion's position, but Cleopatra never wavered in her support for her eldest son. She promoted him as the true heir of Caesar, a direct challenge to Octavian. At the donations of Alexandria in 34 BC, a grand public ceremony, Antony and Cleopatra declared Caesarion to be Caesar's legitimate son and proclaimed him King of Kings. This was a fatal miscalculation. The declaration was a direct provocation to Octavian, who used it to turn Roman public opinion against Antony and Cleopatra. It led to war. When Octavian's forces defeated them at the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra's world collapsed. She knew Caesarion's life was in grave danger. She tried to save him. She sent him away, south to the port of Berenice on the Red Sea, with a plan for him to escape to India. It was a desperate move, but Caesarion never made it. After Cleopatra's death, his tutors were persuaded to bring him back to Alexandria with the false promise that Octavian would allow him to rule. It was a trap. Octavian had him executed. His reasoning was cold and political. 2. Caesars are one too many. Cleopatra's unconventional, power-focused upbringing gave her son all the tools to be a great king. He was educated, politically astute, and understood the game of power. But in the end, no amount of training or linguistic skill could save him from the brutal reality of Roman politics. She had raised him to be a king, but the world had no room for him. Number 14. Why would a queen teach her daughters to rule, not marry? Isabella of Castile demanded that her 4 daughters receive the same rigorous classical education as her son, the heir. They studied Latin, Greek, philosophy, law, and theology with leading humanist scholars. This was at a time when education for royal women was typically limited to music, needlepoint, and domestic skills. Isabella personally oversaw their lessons, believing that a princess's mind was her most important political tool. Isabella of Castile was one of the most powerful and influential rulers of the Renaissance. Alongside her husband, Ferdinand of Aragon, she unified Spain, completed the Reconquista, and funded Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World. She was a queen who ruled in her own right, not merely a consort, and her approach to raising her daughters reflected her own experience and ambition. She was not preparing them to be decorative wives. She was preparing them to be queens. Her daughters were Isabella, Joanna, Maria, and Catherine of Aragon. From birth, their lives were planned as part of a grand strategic vision. Their marriages would be used to forge alliances and encircle Spain's main rival, France. But Isabella knew that a successful royal marriage was more than just a signature on a treaty. It required the queen to be a capable political operator in her own right, able to influence her husband and her new court. So she gave them the education of a prince. The court of Isabella was a center of learning, and her daughters were at its heart. They read classical texts, debated philosophy, and learned the art of rhetoric. They were taught to think critically, to argue persuasively, and to understand the complex web of European politics. Isabella believed that an educated woman was a powerful woman. This was a radical departure from the norm. While other royal courts might educate their princesses, the scope and seriousness of the education Isabella provided was unprecedented. It was an education for governance. She was giving her daughters the intellectual tools they would need to survive and thrive in foreign courts, and they needed them. Each daughter was sent abroad to marry a foreign prince. Catherine of Aragon was sent to England to marry Prince Arthur, and later his brother, King Henry VIII. Her deep learning and piety made a strong impression on the English court. Her refusal to accept the annulment of her marriage to Henry VIII was a testament to the strength of character her mother had instilled in her. She saw herself as a queen, not just a wife to be discarded. The most tragic case was her daughter Joanna. Joanna married Philip the Handsome of the powerful Habsburg dynasty. She was intelligent and passionate, but she also suffered from severe mental health issues. Her political education made her a threat to the men around her, including her husband, her father, and later her own son, who all sought to control her and her inheritance. They declared her mad and imprisoned her for the last 46 years of her life, ruling in her name. Her story is a dark reminder that an educated, powerful woman was still a threat in a man's world. Isabella's parenting method was a calculated political investment. She saw her daughters as extensions of her own power, ambassadors who could project Spanish influence across Europe. She armed them with knowledge because she knew that in the world of court politics, intelligence was a weapon and a shield. Her legacy is complex. She created a dynasty of powerful, educated women who shaped European history for a century. But she also treated them as pieces on a chessboard. Their personal happiness was secondary to the strategic needs of Spain. She gave them the tools to rule, but she also placed them in situations of immense pressure and personal sacrifice. She was a queen first, a mother second. Number 13, should a queen's son be raised by the state? Catherine the Great of Russia had her first child, Paul, taken from her moments after his birth in 1754. The reigning Empress Elizabeth snatched the baby away and raised him herself. When Catherine eventually became empress, she repeated the pattern. She had her grandson, the future Tsar Alexander I, taken from his parents and raised him herself, designing a radical Enlightenment-inspired education for him that included lessons from a Swiss Republican philosopher. Catherine the Great's approach to royal child rearing was shaped by her own traumatic experience. As a young German princess brought to Russia to marry the heir, Peter, she was an outsider. When her son Paul was born, she was treated as nothing more than a vessel. Empress Elizabeth controlled every aspect of Paul's life, from his wet nurses to his tutors. And Catherine was rarely allowed to see him. This separation created a lifelong rift between Catherine and Paul. She found him to be neurotic and unstable, and he grew up resenting the mother he barely knew. When Catherine seized the throne from her unpopular husband, she had her own ideas about how to raise a ruler. She was a student of the Enlightenment, corresponding with philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot. She believed in reason, progress, and education. She saw her grandsons, Alexander and Constantine, as a chance to create a new kind of Russian monarch, an enlightened despot. So she took them from their parents, her son Paul and his wife Maria Feodorovna. She installed the boys in her own apartments in the Winter Palace. She designed their entire world. She wrote a detailed instruction for their education, a 200-page manual filled with the latest pedagogical ideas from thinkers like John Locke. She specified everything from their diet and clothing to the books they should read. She wanted them to be strong and healthy. They were encouraged to run around, play outside, and sleep in cool rooms. This was a direct rejection of the traditional Russian practice of swaddling infants tightly and keeping them in overheated rooms. Their academic education was even more radical. She hired a Swiss intellectual named Frédéric César de la Harpe to be Alexander's head tutor. La Harpe was a Republican. He admired the American Revolution and was critical of absolute monarchy. It was an astonishing choice. The future autocrat of all Russia was being taught the virtues of liberty and the rights of man. Catherine had La Harpe teach Alexander about political theory, history, and philosophy, hoping to mold him into a wise and just ruler. Catherine adored her grandson Alexander. She poured all her hopes and ambitions into him. She openly preferred him to her own son, Paul, whom she considered unfit to rule. She even contemplated changing the line of succession to bypass Paul and name Alexander as her direct heir. This created a poisonous atmosphere in the court. Paul and his wife were isolated, while their children were raised by their grandmother to be something entirely different from them. But the experiment had unintended consequences. The education created a deep conflict in Alexander. He was torn between the liberal ideas of his tutor and the reality of his position as the future absolute monarch of a vast conservative empire. He became a man of contradictions, a ruler who spoke of reform but was often indecisive and suspicious. Catherine's method was an act of supreme confidence and control. She believed she could engineer a perfect ruler through a perfect education. She treated her grandchildren as a state project, a chance to shape the future of Russia, but by removing them from their parents and imposing her own grand vision, she created a family dynamic filled with resentment and dysfunction. She won the battle for her grandson's mind, but at the cost of her relationship with her own son. Number 12, did training a queen for battle and danger her kingdom. Zenobia of Palmyra had her son Vabalithus dress in the full uniform of a Roman general from the age of 10. She insisted he accompany her on military campaigns where he was taught swordsmanship and archery by her best soldiers. Instead of courtly etiquette, his evenings were spent studying military maps and the histories of Alexander the Great and Hannibal. Zenobia was the queen of the Palmyrene Empire, a breakaway state in the Roman province of Syria in the 3rd century AD. She was a warrior queen, a brilliant military and political leader who challenged the might of Rome itself. And she raised her son not to be a king who sat on a throne, but a general who led from the front. Her husband Odeionathus, the ruler of Palmyra, had been a loyal Roman ally. After his assassination, Zenobia took power as regent for their young son Vabalithus, but Zenobia was not content to be a mere placeholder. She had ambitions. She wanted to transform Palmyra from a Roman client state into a major empire. Her parenting was a core part of this strategy. Valiathus was the legitimate heir. His legitimacy gave her rule credibility, but she needed him to be more than a figurehead. She needed him to be a worthy successor, a warrior who could command the respect of their armies, so his childhood was a military apprenticeship. While other princes were learning poetry, Vabilathus was learning logistics. He was hardened to the rigors of camp life. He, learned to ride for days on end, to sleep on the ground, and to eat the same rations as the common soldiers. Zenobia believed that a ruler could not command an army from a palace. He had to share their hardships. She also oversaw his academic education, which was also geared towards war and conquest. He studied Greek and Roman military history. He learned about strategy and tactics from the great commanders of the past. The goal was to create a mind that could think like a general. This was unconventional for any royal upbringing, but especially so given the context. Palmyra was culturally a mix of Semitic, Greek, and Roman influences. By emphasizing a militaristic, Roman-style education for her son Zenobia was making a statement. She was showing that she and her son were not provincial chieftains. They were the equals of Roman emperors. For a time, her strategy was incredibly successful. Under her command, the Palmyrene army conquered Egypt, Anatolia, and much of the Levant. She created an empire that stretched from modern-day Turkey to Egypt. On coins, she styled herself as Augusta, Empress, and Vabiathus as Augustus, Emperor. This was a direct challenge to the Roman Emperor Aurelian. But in raising her son to be a warrior, she was also preparing him for a war she could not win. The Roman Empire, though weakened by internal strife, was still a superpower. Aurelian eventually turned his full attention to the east. He marched his legions against Palmyra. The hardened military education Zenobia gave her son was put to the test. But the Palmyrene armies were no match for the experienced Roman legions. Zenobia and Valiathus were defeated and captured. What happened next is a matter of historical debate. Some sources say Vabiathus died on the journey to Rome. Others say he was paraded in Aurelian's triumph, a public humiliation for him and his mother. Zenobia herself was taken to Rome, where she lived out her life in a villa. Zenobia's attempt to raise a warrior king was a bold gamble. She tried to forge a successor in her own image, a leader who could continue her ambitious project of empire building. She gave him all the skills of a soldier and a general, but she was preparing him for a world she wanted to create, not the world that actually existed. In the end, the very skills she taught him led him into a direct confrontation with a power he could not defeat. Number 11 was a queen's love for science, a form of neglect. Queen Charlotte, the wife of King George III of the United Kingdom, had a dedicated botany room built next to the royal nursery at Kew Palace. She spent hours there with botanists, categorizing plants from Captain Cook's voyages, while her 15 children were managed by their governess. She co-authored scientific papers and was a skilled musician, but her children later complained of a distant and overly formal mother who seemed more interested in her hobbies than in them. Queen Charlotte is often remembered as the long-suffering wife of the mad King George III, but she was also a woman of formidable intellect and diverse interests. She was a passionate amateur botanist, a talented musician who played with Bach's son, and a dedicated patron of the arts. And her approach to motherhood was deeply influenced by her intellectual pursuits. She saw the raising of her children not just as a maternal duty, but as an educational project. With 15 children, the royal nursery was a bustling and highly organized operation. The head of this operation was Lady Charlotte Finch, who served as the royal governess for over 30 years. Lady Charlotte was responsible for the day-to-day care and education of the children, and she implemented a progressive curriculum that was heavily influenced by the Queen's own interests. The education of the princesses was particularly remarkable. At a time when women's education was often superficial, the 6 princesses were taught geography, history, English, French, German, and music. They were also taught practical skills like drawing and needlework. The queen believed in keeping her daughters close, so close that she was reluctant to let any of them marry. She envisioned a quiet, intellectual court where she would be surrounded by her accomplished and unmarried daughters. This desire for control and companionship ultimately led to frustration and unhappiness for the princesses, who felt trapped. The princes received a more formal, classical education designed to prepare them for public life, but the queen's influence was still felt. She encouraged their interest in science and the arts. The family spent a great deal of time at Kew, which, under her and the king's patronage, became a world-leading center for botanical research. The children were expected to take an interest in these projects. However, this focus on intellectual development came at the expense of emotional connection. The queen's relationship with her children was governed by strict etiquette. They were her subjects as well as her children. The princes, in particular, chafed under the rigid control. The eldest, George, the Prince of Wales, rebelled spectacularly, running up massive debts and entering into a secret, illegal marriage. His relationship with his parents was often toxic. As King George III's mental health declined, Queen Charlotte's role changed. She became his guardian, and her life was consumed by his illness. This placed an even greater strain on her relationship with her children. The court became a somber and oppressive place. The queen's legacy as a mother is complicated. On one hand, she was a forward-thinking educationalist who provided her daughters with an education far superior to that of their peers. She fostered a court that valued knowledge and culture. On the other hand, she was a distant and controlling figure. Her children, especially the princes, seemed to crave a level of maternal warmth and freedom that she was unable or unwilling to provide. Her intellectual passions, while admirable, may have served as a buffer or retreat from the messy, emotional demands of raising a large and challenging family. She was a queen of science and art, but perhaps not a queen of hearts for her own children. Number 10, how do you raise a king in a world that hates kings? Hortense, the Beauharnais, Queen of Holland and stepdaughter of Napoleon Bonaparte, raised her son Louis Napoleon in exile. She moved him constantly between Germany, Switzerland, and Italy to avoid assassins and political enemies. She taught him herself, focusing on the history of his uncle, Napoleon, portraying him as a revolutionary hero. She commissioned a special set of toy soldiers, not of French grenadiers, but of Roman legionaries, to teach him about empire and glory without being overtly political. Hortense's life was defined by the rise and fall of Napoleon. As a young woman, she was at the center of imperial power. But after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815, she and her sons were banished from France. She was a queen without a kingdom, and her son, Louis Napoleon, was a prince without a throne. Her approach to parenting was an act of political survival and ideological devotion. Her goal was to keep the Napoleonic dream alive in her son. Raising a future emperor in exile was a dangerous business. The restored monarchies of Europe saw the Bonapartes as a constant threat. Hortense was under surveillance. There were plots to kidnap her sons, so she lived a nomadic life, moving from one safe house to another. This instability was the backdrop to Louis Napoleon's childhood. Her educational program for him was single-minded. It was all about his destiny. She was his primary teacher in his early years. The main textbook was the story of Napoleon. She presented his uncle not as a defeated tyrant, but as a martyr for the cause of French glory and popular sovereignty. She taught him that the name Bonaparte was not a source of shame, but a call to action. She nurtured his ambition. She encouraged his interest in military matters. He attended a military academy in Switzerland. She filled his head with stories of his family's greatness. It was an education in legacy. This was also a lonely childhood. He was a prince, but he had no court. He was French, but he could not live in France. His identity was built around a past he had never known and a future that seemed impossible. His mother was his entire world, his teacher, his protector, and his biggest supporter. Their relationship was intensely close. Hortense also taught him the art of political maneuvering. She was a skilled political operator herself, maintaining a network of contacts and supporters across Europe. She taught him to be patient, to wait for his moment, The results of this upbringing were profound. Louis Napoleon grew up with an unshakable belief in his own destiny. He was convinced that he would one day rule France. This belief led him to make two failed coup attempts in the 1830s and 1840s. They were embarrassing failures, and he was imprisoned. But he never gave up. His mother's teachings had prepared him for this. She had taught him that setbacks were temporary. She had instilled in him a romantic, almost mystical belief in the Napoleonic cause. Eventually his moment came. The Revolution of 1848 overthrew the French monarchy. Louis Napoleon returned to France. Using the power of his famous name, which his mother had so carefully preserved, he was elected president of the French Republic. A few years later, just as his uncle had done, he staged a coup and declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. Hortense's unconventional parenting had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. She had raised her son in the shadow of a fallen empire, feeding him on stories and dreams. She had turned a landless exile into a ruler. She did not live to see him become emperor, but her dedicated, single-minded upbringing was the foundation of his entire political career. She taught him to believe in a myth, and he made that myth a reality. Number 9. Can a Hollywood star be a royal mother? Princess Grace of Monaco banned her children from watching her own movies. She feared it would confuse them and give them a distorted image of her. When her daughter, Princess Caroline, was a teenager, Grace enrolled her in a Paris finishing school, but also insisted she work as an intern at a publishing house to understand the life of a normal working person. She read her children classic literature every night, but also taught them American folk songs on her guitar. Grace Kelly was a Hollywood queen before she became a real-life princess. Her marriage to Prince Rainier III of Monaco in 1956 was a global media event. But the transition from movie star to royal consort and mother was not easy. Her approach to raising her 3 children, Caroline, Albert, and Stephanie, was a unique blend of Hollywood glamour, American practicality, and the strict demands of a European monarchy. One of her biggest challenges was creating a sense of normalcy for children growing up in the spotlight. The Grimaldi family was, and is, under intense media scrutiny. Grace tried to create a private world for her children within the palace walls. The ban on her own films was part of this. She wanted to be their mother, not Grace Kelly, the movie star. She wanted them to see her as a real person, not a character on a screen. She was a more hands-on mother than was typical for European royalty at the time. She was deeply involved in their daily lives, from their education to their social activities. She brought an American sensibility to the nursery. It was less formal, more emotionally expressive. She believed in discipline, but also in affection. Her dual background created a unique cultural upbringing for the children. They were raised to be bilingual in French and English. They learned the formal etiquette of the Monegasque court, but they also spent summers in the United States with their Kelly relatives, where they could experience a more relaxed, middle-class American life. This was a deliberate choice by Grace. She wanted to give her children a broader perspective to keep them grounded. She also tried to instill a sense of duty and responsibility. She founded the Garden Club of Monaco and the Princess Grace Foundation, and she involved her children in her charitable work from a young age. She wanted them to understand that their royal status came with obligations to others, but it was a constant struggle. Raising children in a gilded cage is never easy. The immense wealth and privilege, combined with the constant public attention, created a challenging environment. As they grew into teenagers and young adults, her children, particularly the princesses, rebelled. They became fixtures in the European party scene, and their romantic lives were fodder for the tabloid press. This caused great stress for Princess Grace. She had tried to give them a balanced upbringing, but the pressures of their position were enormous. Her relationship with her eldest daughter, Caroline, was particularly complex and sometimes stormy. Her life came to a tragic end in a car accident in 1982 when she was just 52. Her death was a profound shock to her family and to the world. It left a void in the lives of her children, who were still young adults. Princess Grace's parenting was an experiment in blending two very different worlds. She tried to give her children the best of both the cultural richness and sense of duty of a European monarchy and the warmth and down-to-earth values of her American upbringing. The result was a generation of royals who were more modern and cosmopolitan than their predecessors, but who also struggled to find their place in the world. Number 8. Why would a queen use her children as political pawns? Eleanor of Aquitaine sent her 3-year-old son Richard to be formally invested as the Duke of Aquitaine, her own ancestral land. She then raised him there, away from his father, King Henry II of England, grooming him to be a continental ruler loyal to her, not his father. She arranged the betrothal of her 3-year-old daughter Alix to the French prince and sent the little girl to be raised in the French court, effectively as a hostage. Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. She was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, and she was queen first of France, then of England. She was a woman of immense wealth, intelligence, and ambition, and she viewed her children, all 8 of them, with Henry II, as the primary instruments of her power. Her parenting was a masterclass in medieval dynastic politics. It was not about creating a happy, unified family. It was about securing power, land, and influence. She and Henry II had a vast and unruly collection of territories, the Angevin Empire, which stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. They used their children to manage this empire. From a young age, the children were assigned their future roles. For Henry, the eldest surviving son, was designated the future King of England and Duke of Normandy. Richard was to have his mother's inheritance, Aquitaine. Geoffrey was made Duke of Brittany through marriage. John, the youngest, was initially left without a significant inheritance, earning him the nickname Lackland. Eleanor's relationship with her husband, Henry II, was famously turbulent. They were a power couple, but they were also rivals. As their sons grew older, Eleanor actively encouraged them to defy their father. She had a particularly close bond with Richard, who became the famous Richard the Lionheart. She established her own court in Poitiers in Aquitaine, and it was here that she raised Richard. She taught him the art of politics, the importance of patronage, and the culture of the troubadours. She was shaping him into her son, the ruler of her lands. This culminated in the Great Revolt of 1173-74. Eleanor, along with her sons Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, rebelled against Henry II. It was a family civil war. The revolt failed. Henry II defeated his sons, and, as punishment for her role, he imprisoned Eleanor. She would remain his prisoner for the next 16 years. Even from prison, she continued to influence events through her children. Her daughters were married off to secure alliances, Matilda to the Duke of Saxony, Eleanor to the King of Castile, and Joan to the King of Sicily. These were not love matches, they were strategic moves on the geopolitical chessboard of Europe. When Henry II died and her favorite son, Richard, became king, Eleanor was freed. At the age of 67, she entered the most powerful phase of her life. She ruled England as regent while Richard was away on the Third Crusade. She maneuvered to protect his throne from the ambitions of her youngest son, John. She even traveled across the Alps in the middle of winter to ransom Richard when he was captured on his way home from the crusade. Eleanor's parenting was ruthless and pragmatic. She taught her children that loyalty was conditional and that power was the ultimate prize. She fostered rivalries among them when it suited her purposes. The result was a family of brilliant, ambitious, and deeply dysfunctional individuals who were constantly at war with each other. She was not a nurturing mother in the modern sense. She was a queen who bred kings, and she used them to play the great Game of Thrones. Number 7 was making a prince live like a pauper a good idea. Maria Theresa of Austria, ruler of the Habsburg Empire, had 16 children. To teach her eldest son and heir, the future Emperor Joseph II, humility, she would periodically send him to live in the servants' quarters of the Hofburg Palace. He would eat their simple food, wear their coarse clothes, and perform manual labor alongside them. She also made him accompany her on visits to hospitals and orphanages, not as a prince, but as an assistant. Maria Theresa was the only female ruler in the 650-year history of the Habsburg dynasty. She was a devout Catholic, a shrewd political operator, and a remarkably fertile mother. Her approach to raising her 16 children was a mixture of deep personal piety, strict discipline, and a pragmatic understanding of the demands of rule. She and her husband, Emperor Francis I, created a surprisingly intimate family life for a major European monarchy. Unlike many royal parents of the era, they were actively involved in their children's lives. Maria Theresa received daily reports on their behavior and progress. But this involvement did not mean it was a relaxed or permissive environment. The imperial nursery was run with an almost military precision. Her primary focus was on moral and religious education. She wanted her children to be good Catholics and responsible rulers. She was deeply concerned about the dangers of pride and arrogance, especially for her heir, Joseph. This is why she devised her unusual methods for teaching him humility. She believed that a future emperor needed to understand the lives of his poorest subjects. By forcing him to live and work like a commoner, she was trying to build empathy and a sense of duty. The educational regime was intense. The children's days were filled with lessons in languages, history, mathematics, and religion. There was little time for idle play. Maria Theresa was particularly concerned with controlling her children's behavior. She wrote a document called the Order of Conduct, which laid out detailed rules for everything from how they should pray to how they should behave at the dinner table. She also used her children as instruments of foreign policy. This was the age of marriage politics, and Maria Theresa was its greatest master. She strategically married her daughters to princes across Europe to forge alliances and secure peace. The most famous of these was her youngest daughter, Marie Antoinette, who was sent to France to marry the future Louis XVI and became known to history as Marie Antoinette. These were often difficult matches, and the daughters were sent off to foreign courts with strict instructions from their mother on how to behave and how to best serve the interests of the Habsburg dynasty. Her relationship with her son and heir, Joseph, was complex and often contentious. The humility lessons did have an effect, but perhaps not the one she intended. Joseph grew up to be an earnest, hardworking, and reform-minded ruler. He was impatient with tradition and court ceremony. But he was also autocratic and unwilling to compromise. He and his more conservative mother clashed frequently when they were co-rulers. He respected her, but he was determined to rule in his own way. Maria Theresa's parenting was a product of her deep sense of responsibility. She saw herself as the mother of her country, and she saw her own children as its future guardians. Her methods were sometimes harsh, but they were born of a desire to raise rulers who were pious, disciplined, and dedicated to the welfare of their people. She was both a loving mother and a demanding queen, and the two roles were, in her mind, inseparable. Number 6, why would a queen isolate her son in a golden cage? An Empress Dowager Cixi of China chose her 3-year-old nephew Guangxu to be the new emperor in 1875. She then raised him in the Forbidden City. He was forbidden from playing with other children. His only companions were the adult eunuchs who served him. Cixi controlled his education completely, ensuring his tutors taught him to be obedient and to defer to her judgment in all matters of state. He was an emperor in name, but a prisoner in reality. Cixi was the de facto ruler of China for nearly 50 years. She was a master of court politics, a brilliant and ruthless strategist who held power through a series of young, weak emperors whom she could control. Her parenting of the Guangxu emperor was not about raising a strong and capable leader. It was about creating a perfect puppet. Guangxu was taken from his family and brought into the Forbidden City, a vast walled palace complex in the heart of Beijing. It was a world of immense luxury, but also of suffocating ritual and isolation. He was the son of heaven, the ruler of hundreds of millions of people. But he had no freedom. Cixi orchestrated his entire existence. She selected his tutors, who were instructed to emphasize classical texts that stressed filial piety and obedience. He was taught that his primary duty was to defer to the wisdom and experience of the Empress Dowager. He was given no practical education in governance, economics, or military affairs. That was Sixie's domain. His personal life was just as controlled. He was surrounded by eunuchs who reported his every word and action back to Sixie. He had no friends his own age. The Forbidden City was his entire world, and Sixie was its absolute ruler. This environment of total control and isolation had a predictable effect on the young emperor. He grew up to be a nervous, shy, and melancholic man. As he reached adulthood, Guangxu began to yearn for real power. A group of reform-minded scholars and officials saw him as their best hope for modernizing China, which was struggling to deal with the pressures of Western imperialism and internal decay. They gained the emperor's trust, and in 1898, he launched the 100 Days Reform. It was a bold attempt to overhaul the Chinese government, military, and education system. For a brief period, it seemed that the puppet had cut his strings. The emperor issued a flood of reformist edicts from the Forbidden City. But he had underestimated Cixi. She had spent decades building her power base in the court and the army. She saw the reforms as a direct threat to her authority and to the conservative Manchu establishment. With the backing of the military, she staged a coup. The emperor was placed under house arrest on a small island in one of the lakes within the Forbidden City. The reformers were executed or fled into exile. Cixi resumed her position as regent. The Guangxu emperor would spend the last 10 years of his life as a prisoner in his own palace. He was emperor in name only. He was forced to perform the empty rituals of his office, but he held no real power. Cixi continued to rule in his name. He died in 1908, just one day before Cixi herself died. The timing has always been suspicious, and modern forensic tests on his remains have shown that he died of acute arsenic poisoning, almost certainly on Cixi's orders. She could not bear the thought of him outliving her and perhaps resuming his reforms. Cixi's parenting of Guangxu was the ultimate act of political control. She raised him not to be a ruler, but to be a symbol. She gave him a title, but denied him power. She built a golden cage around him and kept him there his entire life. It was a strategy that allowed her to maintain her grip on China, but it came at the cost of a young man's life, and arguably at the cost of China's future. Number 5, did a formal upbringing create a cold king? Her Queen Mary of Teck, the wife of King George V of the United Kingdom, insisted that her 6 children bow or curtsy to her every morning. She rarely visited the nursery, believing that children should be kept at a distance and raised by professionals. Her relationship with her sons, the future King Edward V and King George VI, was so formal that they communicated mostly through letters, even when living in the same house. The Queen Mary was the model of a 20th century British monarch, dignified, formal, and utterly dedicated to the institution of the crown. She saw the monarchy as the bedrock of the nation, and her primary duty was to uphold its standards. This philosophy extended to her parenting. She raised her children not to be happy individuals, but to be flawless representatives of the monarchy. The royal nursery at Sandringham and Buckingham Palace was a world away from the Queen's state apartments. It was run by a head nanny, Charlotte Alla Bill. The children spent most of their time with her and other staff. Visits from their parents were scheduled, and formal events. The children would be dressed in their best clothes and brought down to see the king and queen, often for a brief period before bedtime. Queen Mary believed in discipline and emotional restraint. Public displays of affection were considered improper. Her children were taught from a very young age to suppress their feelings and to always present a dignified public face. This created an emotional distance that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Her eldest son, David, who would become King Edward V, was a charming and popular prince, but he chafed under the rigid formality of his upbringing. He found his parents to be cold and critical. His decision to abdicate the throne in 1936 to marry Wallace Simpson, a divorced American, was in many ways a rebellion against the stuffy, duty-bound world his parents represented. Her second son, Albert, or Bertie, who became King George VI after his brother's abdication, was a shy and sensitive child with a severe stammer. The lack of parental warmth and constant pressure to conform to a royal ideal exacerbated his anxieties. He was terrified of his father, King George V, a stern former naval officer. His relationship with his mother was respectful, but not close. It was his wife, Elizabeth Boas Lyon, the future Queen Mother, who provided the emotional support and encouragement he needed to overcome his stammer and grow into his role as king. Queen Mary's methods were not unusual for the British upper class of her time. Children were often seen as projects to be managed by staff rather than individuals to be nurtured by parents. But the stakes were higher for royal children. Any perceived flaw or misstep could reflect badly on the monarchy itself. Mary's formality was also a defense mechanism. She was a deeply shy woman who found public life a strain. The strict etiquette of court life provided a structure and a shield. She applied the same structure to her family life. The consequences of this upbringing were profound. It produced one son who rejected the crown entirely and another who accepted it with great reluctance and personal suffering. While Queen Mary successfully upheld her vision of a dignified and unwavering monarchy, the personal cost to her children was high. Her belief in duty over affection shaped the characters of two kings and the course of British history. Number 4, why did an intellectual queen abandon her children? Caroline of Ansbach, wife of King George II of Great Britain, left her 7 children in the care of governesses for months at a time while she engaged in political strategy and intellectual debates with the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole. She established a literary salon at court and corresponded with the philosopher Leibniz, but her children, particularly her son Frederick, Prince of Wales, grew up to resent her deeply, seeing her intellectual and political life as a form of maternal abandonment. Queen Caroline was one of the most intellectually formidable and politically influential queen consorts in British history. In the early 18th century, a time when women were largely excluded from public life, she was a major political player. She was the chief advisor to her husband, King George II, and formed a powerful working partnership with the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole. She was, in many ways, the de facto ruler. But this deep engagement in the world of politics and ideas came at a price. Her role as a mother was a distant second to her role as a queen and political strategist. She bore 9 children, 7 of whom survived to adulthood. From a young age, they were handed over to a large staff of tutors and governesses. Caroline would oversee their education from a distance, ensuring they received a modern, enlightened curriculum. But she was not a hands-on mother. Her relationship with her eldest son, Frederick, was particularly disastrous. Frederick was left behind in Hanover when his parents moved to England to secure their position in the new Hanoverian dynasty. He did not join them until he was 21 years old. This long separation created a permanent rift. When he finally arrived in England, he was a stranger to his own family. Frederick and his mother became bitter political and personal enemies. He saw her as a cold, calculating woman who had abandoned him. She saw him as a frivolous, irresponsible spendthrift who was unfit to be king. They supported rival political factions and openly insulted each other. The Prince of Wales's residence, Leicester House, became the center of the political opposition to the king and queen. This family feud was a major political scandal of the age. Caroline did not hide her disdain for her son. She once famously remarked, "My dear firstborn is the greatest ass, and the greatest liar, and the greatest canaille, and the greatest beast in the whole world, and I heartily wish he were out of it." It's hard to imagine a more damning statement from a mother about her child. Caroline's priorities were clear. Her passion was for power and intellectual life. She preferred the company of politicians, artists, and thinkers to the company of her own children. Her library was her sanctuary. Her conversations with Walpole about policy were her real work. Her children were a dynastic necessity, a duty she had fulfilled, but not the center of her world. This was not simply a case of a cold mother. It was a reflection of a queen who refused to be confined to the traditional female role of her time. She carved out a position of immense influence for herself in a man's world. But the tools she used to do this, her intellect, her ambition, her focus on politics, were the very things that alienated her from her children, especially the son who was supposed to be her successor. She was a brilliant queen, but a failed mother. The tragedy is that in her time, it may have been impossible to be both. Number 3 was a modern queen too protective. Queen Rania of Jordan personally manages her children's social media accounts. In a world where young royals are constant targets for paparazzi and online gossip, she has taken the unusual step of being her own family's storyteller, sharing carefully curated photos and updates to control the public narrative. She has also spoken about giving her 4 children regular household chores like taking out the trash and cleaning their rooms to counteract the effects of growing up in a palace. And Queen Rania is a new kind of queen for a new century. She is a global advocate for education and health, a social media powerhouse with millions of followers, and a style icon. Her approach to, raising her 4 children, Crown Prince Hussein, Princess Iman, Princess Salma, and Prince Hashem is a conscious effort to balance the demands of a modern monarchy with the desire to raise grounded, well-adjusted individuals. One of her most unconventional methods is her use of social media. Traditionally, royal families have maintained a strict distance from the public, communicating through official press offices. Rania has embraced platforms like Instagram and Twitter to offer a glimpse into her family's life. This is a strategic move. By releasing her own photos of family birthdays, holidays, and graduations, she satisfies public curiosity on her own terms. It allows her to control the image of her family, presenting them as close-knit and relatable rather than distant and privileged. It's a way of fighting the intrusive tabloid culture by beating it at its own game. This desire to create a sense of normalcy extends to their private life. Queen Rania and King Abdullah II have made a concerted effort to shield their children from the full weight of their royal status. The emphasis on household chores is a simple but powerful example. In a world where everything is done for them by staff, making them responsible for their own space is a way to teach them self-reliance and humility. Their education has also been a blend of tradition and modernity. The children have been educated abroad in the United States and the United Kingdom to give them a global perspective. Crown Prince Hussein attended Georgetown University following in his father's footsteps. This is part of preparing them for a world that is increasingly interconnected. Queen Rania has spoken about the importance of open communication with her children. She encourages them to discuss their concerns and to have their own opinions. This is a departure from the more formal, hierarchical parenting styles of past monarchies. It's an approach that values emotional intelligence as much as academic achievement. However, this protective and carefully managed upbringing has its own challenges. Can you truly raise a normal child when their life is anything but? The curated social media feed, while a smart media strategy, also presents a sanitized, perfect version of family life. It is, in its own way, a form of performance. The central task for Queen Rania has been to prepare her children, especially the Crown Prince, for their future roles as leaders of Jordan, a country in a complex and often volatile region. Her modern, hands-on, and media-savvy approach is a gamble. It's a bet that raising royals who are relatable, globally minded, and emotionally aware will make them more effective leaders in the 21st century. It is a very different model from the distant duty first approach of queens of the past, and its ultimate success will be judged by the generation of leaders she is now shaping. Number 2, how can you raise a king who doesn't want to be king? Queen Letizia of Spain reportedly banned her daughters, Princess Leonor and Princess Sofia, from using iPads or watching television on weeknights. She personally drops them off at their private school in Madrid and is known for attending parent-teacher meetings. To ensure they have a broad perspective, she has taken them on secret outings using public transport and visiting local markets in an attempt to give them a taste of a non-royal life. Queen Letizia was a successful journalist and news anchor before she married the future, King Felipe VI of Spain. She was a commoner, a professional woman who had built her own career. This background has profoundly shaped her approach to raising the future Queen of Spain, Princess Leonor, and her sister, Princess Sophia. Her goal is to create a modern, streamlined monarchy, and that starts with a grounded, disciplined, and private upbringing for her daughters. Letizia's parenting style can be described as intensely hands-on and protective. She and King Felipe are the primary caregivers, a stark contrast to past Spanish monarchs who relied heavily on staff. They are deeply involved in every aspect of their daughters' lives, from their diet, which is said to be rich in organic fruits and vegetables and low in sugarland, to their education. The focus is on discipline and a strong work ethic. The reported limits on screen time are part of a philosophy that emphasizes reading, learning, and family interaction over passive entertainment. The girls are being raised to be bilingual in Spanish and English, and they are also learning other languages, including Mandarin and the regional languages of Spain, like Catalan and Basque. This is part of preparing them for their roles in a diverse and modern Spain. Privacy is a top priority. Unlike some other European royal families, the Spanish royals release very few photos of their children. They appear at a handful of official events each year, but otherwise they are kept out of the public eye. Letizia's trips on the subway or to the local cinema with her daughters are part of this effort. She is trying to carve out a space where they can be children, not just princesses. This is a constant battle against the relentless Spanish press, and it has earned Letizia a reputation for being controlling. This protective approach is also a response to the recent history of the Spanish monarchy. The reign of King Felipe's father, Juan Carlos I, ended in scandal and abdication. Felipe and Letizia know that the future of the monarchy in Spain depends on its ability to be seen as modern, trustworthy, and respectable. Their daughter's upbringing is a key part of this rebranding project. They must be seen as serious, well-behaved, and dedicated. The pressure on the heir, Princess Leonor, is immense. She is being trained from a young age for a future role as queen. She has already begun to take on public duties, giving speeches and attending official ceremonies. Her education is now following a path similar to her father's, which includes a period of military training. Letizia's methods are those of a modern professional mother who happens to be a queen. She is applying the principles of discipline, hard work, and careful image management that she learned in her previous career to the task of raising a future monarch. It is an attempt to professionalize royalty, to strip away the unnecessary pomp and focus on the core duties of service and leadership. It is a high-stakes experiment in creating a 21st century queen. Number one, what if your mother was your rival? Her Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh of Egypt, raised her stepson, the future Thutmose III, in the royal court. While she ruled as pharaoh, she gave him a military education and eventually made him the head of her armies. But she never ceded power to him. For 20 years, he was the junior partner, the heir waiting in the wings, while his stepmother wore the false beard and ruled as a king. On many monuments, her image is in the foreground and his is smaller, placed behind her. The story of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III is one of the most fascinating and unusual parenting dynamics in royal history. Hatshepsut was the daughter of one pharaoh and the wife of another. When her husband, Thutmose II, died, the heir was his son by a minor wife, a young boy named Thutmose III. Hatshepsut was supposed to rule as regent, a temporary placeholder until her stepson came of age, but Hatshepsut had other ideas. She was a woman of immense ambition and political skill. Within a few years, she did something unprecedented. She had herself crowned pharaoh, the full king of Egypt. She adopted all the male titles and ceremonial dress, including the traditional false beard. She was not a queen ruling for her son. She was a king ruling in her own right. This created a very strange situation for the young Thutmose III. He was the rightful heir, but he was powerless. He was being raised by the woman who had, in effect, usurped his throne. Hatshepsut's approach to his upbringing was a careful balancing act. She could not simply get rid of him. He was the legitimate male heir, and his presence gave her own rule a degree of legitimacy. So she kept him close. She gave him a first-class education as befitting a prince. Crucially, she directed his training towards the military. By making him the commander of her armies, she was giving him a role and a power base, but one that kept him busy and far from the political center of Thebes. While he was on military campaigns, she was at home, building her magnificent temples and managing the state. It was a brilliant political move. She was using him, but she was also training him. For 2 decades, this arrangement held. Hatshepsut was the senior pharaoh, the dominant political force. Thutmose III was her subordinate. The art of the period reflects this. In reliefs, she is always the central figure. He is shown as a smaller figure, standing behind her. What Thutmose III truly thought during these years is unknown. Did he resent his stepmother for taking his throne, or did he respect her as a powerful and effective ruler? Was he patiently waiting for his turn, or was he plotting against her? The historical record is silent on his personal feelings. When Hatshepsut died, Thutmose III finally became the sole ruler of Egypt, and it was now that his military education paid off. He embarked on a series of brilliant military campaigns that expanded the Egyptian empire to its greatest extent. He became known as the Napoleon of Egypt, one of the greatest military pharaohs in history. But late in his reign, something strange happened. Thutmose III began a campaign to erase Hatshepsut's memory. Her name and image were chiseled off temples and monuments throughout Egypt. Her statues were smashed and buried. It was an attempt to write her out of history, to pretend her reign had never happened. Historians have long debated the reason for this. Was it an act of personal revenge, the final outburst of a man who had resented his stepmother his entire life? Or was it a cold political calculation, an attempt to restore the traditional order of male kingship and smooth the succession for his own son? The story of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III is a powerful example of how a royal upbringing can be shaped by raw political ambition. Hatshepsut was both a mother figure and a political rival to her stepson. She raised him, educated him, and gave him power, but she always made sure it was less power than her own. Her unconventional parenting produced one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, but it was a relationship built on a foundation of usurped power, and it ended with an attempt to erase her from existence.